my Azula cosplay for Comic-Con, I knew that to place quality was of utmost importance. But how do you add quality without laboring on the cosplay for an extensive period of time? How do you add precise details without heavy equipment like 3D printers or laser cutters? Using simple yet effective methods to create details and quality, I wanted this cosplay to look like something that could be in a museum. I wanted to take this simple animated design and make it absolutely extravagant, without breaking the bank or clock, of course. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Starting with this red velvet curtain, I traced my pattern off of clothes that I already had. This is how I mainly make my patterns. Something I had to keep in mind while creating this cosplay is that I'm wearing it in Phoenix weather, so I have to make it as cool as possible. This means I couldn't add a lining, so all the garments are French seamed. In case if you aren't aware, a French seam is where you sew the fashion sides of your fabric together first, and then turn them inside out and make another seam. This means all of your seam allowance is completely enclosed. To give myself the best mobility as possible, I added gussets between the sleeves. I added decorative stitching, frog closures, piping, and then cotton around the arms and legs to slide the armor on. These were simple garments, not to mention I couldn't add a lining, so the first thing I focused on was making them as clean as I could. When it comes to craftsmanship, especially in a masquerade setting, you can have a visually beautiful costume, but if it has loose threads, holes, and unpressed seams, it will not qualify for craftsmanship. Since I was concerned that I would lose points for not having a lining, I made sure to French seam all of my garments, and even though it was difficult, I pressed all my seams carefully. I also thought about the practicality of the garment, especially with the armor. For armor and sewing hybrid builds, this is something you have to think about, especially when it comes to the attachments. So I gathered the bottom of my sleeves and pants into a thinner tube made from cotton, that way the armor can slide easily over. This not only makes the costume easier to put on, but shows that you consider the realistic practicality of the cosplay. Obviously, I focused on adding details, but it's important to do this strategically. I could have embroidered a beautiful piece on the back of the top, but no one would see it. It's more important to use your time wisely on details that will make an impact. For example, my new sewing machine has a decorative stitch which I decided to add around the hem of the garment. You can see it on the collar, and it embraces the royalty aspect of Azula's character. Speaking of the royalty aspect, what type of fabrics would she wear? Material choice is an important aspect, especially when it comes to quality and making a cosplay stand out. For this, I went with a dark red velvet. It makes the costume more visually appealing with its texture. And I won't forget to mention, it adds a bit of difficulty as velvet can be a tricky fabric to work with, but more of that in my next video. While this is a detail that is difficult to see from afar but still makes an impact, is the gold piping on the collar and waistband, as it has a very formal texture. Finally, I chose brown frog closures that have small beads put into them to help catch light. Although these details didn't take me very long to do, they certainly make an impact, especially when it comes to craftsmanship judging. These are details the judges will really appreciate. And by being strategic, I have plenty of time for more important embellishments on other parts of the cosplay. Starting off this part of the project a little bit differently, I used iron-on stiffener to draft my pattern. You'll see why I did this later. But for now, the pattern consists of 6 pieces with a small gusset in the back so that way it can be cinched later up with grommets. Now for my fabric. This was a thrifted curtain like most of the fabric from this cosplay, of which I used the iron-on stiffener to help prevent fraying. You see, when I cut out this fabric, by the time I had everything ready to go and about to go in the machine, most of this seam allowance you see here was already gone. But the reason why I went with this fabric in the first place is because of its woven texture, which gives it a much more realistic feel. And let's just say I was very dead set on that texture because as you can see, it frays like a nightmare. Another problem with using a low-quality material is whether or not it's going to be able to stand up to the weight of the heavy embroidery, but I decided to think about this from a historical context. You see, I was inspired by a lot of Avatar cosplayers who inspired their costumes off of things like Chinese opera costumes and historical armor. Obviously, the long tails in the front are a great place to put embroidery, so I started doing designs. Obviously, I wanted the Fire Nation emblem, but I also wanted to incorporate some sort of creature or plant from the series that could represent Azula's character. And as you can see, I went with the dragons that you see in the episode where Aang and Zuko go find the firebending masters. They could also represent Avatar Roku and Fire Lord Sozin's dragons. But starting off first with the Fire Nation emblem, I decided to do this in metal pearl along with beads. This took quite a while to do as I had to use a lot of pearl, and I also wanted to do a gradient, so I had to use a lot of different materials to complete it. I created the emblem onto transfer paper and then ironed it directly onto the fabric. This way I knew where to place my padding, which I made sure had enough gaps for the beads that create the various values of the design. Another thing that I was really inspired by for this cosplay was traditional Chinese embroidery. Traditional Chinese embroidery is characterized by mainly satin stitches placed together to create gradients and full images. Using real mulberry silk thread, this is something I had to recreate. Along with the embroidery, I wanted to add beads to make sure it blends into the rest of the costume. As stated before, the fabric is rather flimsy, so I was inspired by another historical technique known as sachiko. Sachiko, or also known as little stabs, is a running stitch created through fabric to mend it and preserve it. Now obviously, I didn't replicate the whole technique in its entirety, but I was inspired by another medium, this being the phenomenal embroidery of Game of Thrones. Because embroidery isn't just creating images in fabric, it's also adding texture and overall durability. I was really playing with the dragon concept of Azula's character, so obviously I had to represent Daenerys' costumes in some way, which in return strengthened the fabric significantly and made the costume so much more durable. Once I was finished with my embellishments, I redid the same pattern I did before onto transfer paper onto the cotton that I used for the lining, which has a small dragon scale texture. I really like that as it added a lot of value to the costume. Once that was complete, I added the orange seam tape and added grommets so it can be laced up. Like I mentioned earlier, people inspired costumes from Avatar based on Chinese opera costumes, historical armor, and traditional clothing. As someone who has an interest in historical clothing, this was something I was very excited to research as a part of this cosplay. I feel like this aspect makes cosplay so much more meaningful as you get to preserve and learn techniques from all over the world, some of them being ancient. But I wasn't just inspired by strictly historical techniques. As you saw, I love the embroidery in Game of Thrones. The way stitching is used to create texture and detail, especially since embroidery is commonly used to create images in the cloth. But textured embroidery is a tremendous skill I can't wait to use more of, as not everything needs a picture on it. Because creating quality for a cosplay, especially in a competition setting, isn't about doing things for the hell of it. A lot of beginner competitive cosplayers, myself included, have assumed that created quality is utilizing high-quality fabrics, embroidering incredible imagery on parts of the costume that no one will see. But with this formula, the costumes will take an excruciating amount of time to complete. In my opinion, true quality can also come from the inspiration, as this can make a cosplay truly stand out. The judges love to hear what inspired you. It's already a given that you cut the cloth and sewed it and glued your foam. But what unique personal quality have you added that stands out from the competition? This is where quality truly comes from. I began with 6mm EVA foam for Azula's armor. Next, I drafted my pattern onto paper. Next, I transferred everything onto EVA foam. These are just my boot patterns from Katusha. Now, you're probably wondering how I got all that texture. I started off with an image of the texture online. Next, using spray glue, I attached a normal piece of paper to wax paper and then printed out my pattern onto that. You see, the ink doesn't absorb into the paper, so it just sits on top of the wax paper, creating a stamp. This technique is super quick, and that way I can get immediately into using my wood burning tool to create the pattern. The pattern you see is inspired off of traditional Chinese armor. I had a goal with this armor to create a lot of detail with simple techniques, while of course maintaining good craftsmanship, so I had a really good time getting creative with these methods. Like I said in my intro, I wanted this armor to look fantasy yet like something that could come into a museum. Which in the end, my overall goal with this cosplay was to create simple yet effective detail that doesn't take excruciating amounts of time. Now to do the pauldrons. I really wanted to incorporate a dragon, so I did them here. However, I didn't use the stamp method like before, and I just freehanded these ones on. Using a wood burning tool is probably one of the greatest things I've ever done for armor, as it doesn't take excruciating amounts of time to create great detail. Here are the pauldrons before priming and painting. Now to create the raised edges. I got these foam dowel triangles from SKS Cosplay Supply. Please check them out, they make some really good products. The last thing I needed to do was seal the edges with quick seal. Now it's time for my favorite part, the filigree molds. As you can see, I used silicone cake molds and filled them up with hot glue to create the pieces. Once they were complete, I just glued them on with more hot glue. This was definitely a bit of a time-consuming part, but it was definitely worth it for it creates such an incredible detail. I used different shape molds along with googly eyes to create bolts and texture. Once that was complete, I primed it with Mod Podge and painted it black, which creates a good base for metallic paints. Now I'm going to show you how I did this unique paint job. I start by taking paint and painting over the whole surface with the gold. Now using a damp paper towel, I wipe away the excess paint. You're going to want to make sure you've primed it pretty well so that way the bottom paint doesn't rub off. Finally, I wipe away the excess with a dry paper towel. And here's what it looks like complete. The Mod Podge ended up being a great sealer as it's pretty thin so that way it doesn't go and fill in all the creases. Next, I painted the raised edges. Believe it or not, this was my first major armor build, and I had learned a lot from previous projects and was really excited to take this on. It was really fun learning how to create intricate detail with very simple materials, like how I created this belt buckle. I started off with these small glass beads that were really too small to use for anything. Then I laid them in the shape and finally cast them in clear tacky glue, kind of like a resin. Now, if you do use this method for anything, make sure you let the tacky glue dry for 24 hours in a laying down position, otherwise it will run. Now for the leather gauntlets. I really want to thank Appa for lending me the leather. Once the shapes are cut and sewn, I dye it with the blood of my enemies. I mean, Angela's leather dye in Army Tan. Once the dye job was complete, I put piping around the edges. I also did the same for these shoe covers, and by the way, I thrifted these shoes. As a final detail, I added Swarovskis in the eyes of the dragon. Now, I'm going to show you how I attached all this armor. I really needed strong attachments for my performance. So, to connect the pauldrons, I started with D-rings, which I glued into the foam. I did this on both the underside of the shoulder plate and the pauldrons. Finally, elastic is looped through and bolted into place. I also glued some elastic into the back of the armor and over the shoulders on the chest plate. I pull the back elastic through the top of the back plate, which then wraps around my ribs and velcros to 2 D-rings glued underneath the chest plate. This kept the armor from riding up and stayed in place during my performance. For the sides of the chest plate, leg armor, gauntlets, and belt, I laced them up using grommets. The grommets are punched into fabric which is glued inside the armor. The shoe decoration just slides over with elastic and can be put on different shoes for various needs. I competed with this cosplay at FanFusion 2024 and won 3rd place in the Masters category. Winning at Comic-Con, especially of this size, was a massive milestone and was an experience I learned a lot from. It was an amazing opportunity to understand craftsmanship competitions, with the main thing that I learned being that to win at a high level, you need to utilize a plethora of techniques. For example, a simpler design is going to have fewer areas to exercise creativity and craftsmanship. But on this cosplay, there was embroidery, beading, metalwork just on the tunic alone. Not to mention the question of how to add durability. I even got to incorporate some of my favorite historical techniques like leatherwork and learn new techniques like traditional Chinese embroidery. And finally, I got to experiment with EVA foam. Since I predominantly do sewing, this was so much fun to explore. All of this adds so much value in one costume, both in the inspiration and the execution. And while the core of craftsmanship will always be the cleanness of your work, this cosplay was a fun exercise on inspiration and cosplay amplification both in quality and design.